We've got that all set up. So next we have David Mather presenting on public archaeology at Petaga Point, Kathio National Historic Landmark.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks, Jim. Being co-principal investigator with Jim for these public archaeology projects is easily one of the coolest things I've ever been able to do in my career. So thank you, Jim, for that as well. The projects that or the related projects I'm going to be talking about are cooperative efforts between the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office and Mille Lacs Kathio State Park, and throughout the time that the work has been done in consultation with the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe's Tribal Historic Preservation Office. Oops. Sorry, I see it here, I think. How do I advance? There we go. Thank you. Right there. I can remember that. Yeah, so Jim talked about this, but Kathio National Historic Landmark was designated in 1964, and it was done in recognition of the deep ancestry of the Dakota Nation at Mille Lacs, as reflected in the archaeological sites, and also the contact there in the late 17th century with French explorers Duluth and Hennepin. And Petaga Point is also individually listed in the National Register of Historic Places. I'm having trouble. There we go. So the burned house that Jim talked about that was excavated in 1967, found in 1966, was kind of what was on our mind at the start of this project. And we didn't really, I think, envision that we would still be doing this so much later. But in 1966, Peter Bleed, in basically the last day practically of his excavation there, they were interested in these these oval shaped sort of depressions with tall grass. They trenched into one of them and found a layer of burned material buried in the ground. Eldon Johnson was very interested in this and came back with a crew of students the following year and excavated a huge area and defined the limits of this rectangular semi-subterranean house with an entrance passage. Bleed's excavation was shown on his map and in his report. The 1967 excavation we could not find records of or there were not easily available records to us. We weren't sure where exactly that happened. They had talked about a number of houses in the area, maybe 5, maybe 7. It's kind of a little bit unclear. In 2006, in the spring, Jim and I were walking around that part of the site, and we figured out, for the first time for us anyway, where we were reasonably certain Eldon had dug in 1967. Near there, we happened to notice sort of oval-shaped depression on the ground with the grass growing a bit differently, and it was just the time of year that made it show up. And we wondered, is this one of the other houses? Maybe. We tried to figure out how we would investigate that possibility, and we decided to do a public archaeology project. Kathio Archaeology Day had been an ongoing program at the state park for a long time. We decided to add an actual excavation, and there's lots of different ways to do public archaeology programs. This is one that we devised for this, to show a real research project, and so we kind of dubbed it a public watching event, because it's a sensitive site. It's a very important site. It's a complicated, well, it turned out to be a very complicated excavation. So we couldn't have the public, actually digging or anything, but we could interpret what we were doing. And so we called it, half seriously, the zoo animal approach, where the zoo animal, usually me, was digging, actually just doing the regular thing, hand excavation, trowels, screens, all this stuff. And the other person, usually Jim, was continually reinterpreting over and over and over what was happening to people as they just walked up to the dig, because all sorts of other things were going on around the area. And so people would come and they go, and sometimes we'd have dozens or more people there. Other times we'd have hardly any. And so we also had school groups come, usually the day before. So it was Nayashing and Ricori Middle School, and I think Mille Lacs Academy. And over the 10 years that we did this part of the project, we reached about 5,000 people, just from the fieldwork component, which was kind of a cool thing. One thing we learned pretty quickly was that we couldn't dig it all on archaeology day. And so Jim and I would come back, you know, sometimes the next day or often the next day, sometimes repeatedly through the fall to finish the excavation. And sometimes it was just Jim and I as the snow was falling before the ground froze. Other times it was opportunities for family to come along, and it was a really lovely experience to be able to dig in such a beautiful place with friends and family. The material from the excavation and the programs fed into a lot of other public archaeology programs at the park. Snowshoeing into the past, we just did that, I think, a week ago or a little bit more, and we're, you know, can get out across the landscape in the winter. Also canoeing into the past out in Ogeechee and on the Rum River provide good opportunities to talk about Petaga Point as well as the other sites of the landmark. Jim has designed some really nice cooking demonstrations, cooking wild rice there in a replica Kathio pot that Grant Goltz made. It's a very cool thing. And of course, it is a real research project. So when we started this, we didn't know exactly where it would go, because of course, how could we? On the map there on the lower left side is our excavation unit 2006. We just numbered them for the year, and we found some artifacts. We found some kind of ephemeral indications of a burn layer, but we weren't really sure. We went east in 2007, and that was really, really confusing until we got deep into the unit and we realized that we were actually digging in old excavation blocks that were undocumented as far as we could tell. And by the dumbest luck in the world, we had happened to actually hit a corner where there was a preserved bulk between two large excavation units. And in that bulk, which was like 20 centimeters wide, there was the burn layer and there were artifacts. And so we were absolutely in one of the houses and it had burned as well. And so for the next few years, we just followed that burn layer. Oh, the 1967 photo on the lower left shows, I mean, that must be very close to where we're digging, but it's not quite the exact spot. But you can see the bulks that they've got between these large excavation blocks. And that seems to be what's showing up in blue in our excavation area. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I wanted to go back. Yeah, so then anyway, we followed the bulk. We decided then to try to get out across the excavation unit. We were going to the north, and over several years, we skimmed through a few units and never reached the other side of it. Finally gave up, came back to the west side, and at the edge of the house feature, found some postmolds along the perimeter of the house. And then the very last unit on the far left side in 2015, we intentionally moved away from the house just to confirm that we were out of it. And that was indeed the case. This is like I have some mental block with advancing this thing. There we go. In 2011, Dave Mackey from Archaeophysics did a geophysical survey of the area around our dig for us. It was a pro bono public education project that his company did, and it was a really remarkable insight to the area of our investigation. He's pulling the ground penetrating radar in this photograph, and the sled is hooked up by cable to his laptop there, and the distortion you see in the colors on the screen is like he's pulling right at that moment the sled over one of the house features, and so that's the actual data. It's all magic to me. And he interpreted it at great length. He used different methods as well. This is just one kind of composite image that he put together. On the right side of the square there is that you can see where Eldon Johnson's 1967 excavation happened, in the kind of reddish areas where our excavation was happening. So those are two of the houses. This is a radar image, and the faint kind of dark gray lines are soil compression, and one of them goes, you can see, right to what seems to be the entrance passage to the house that was excavated in 1967. Others go off to the north, and some of the other houses were there. So these seem to be the remnants of footpaths from when this little cluster of houses was in use. You can see here on the lower right, and actually the upper right, This is the remnant of the burn layer that we were able to recover, so we could dig down to it. We could carefully uncover it. It was very fragile. Map it, draw it, photograph it, all that stuff, and then carefully remove it for analysis. On the west side, on the left, there are some of the postmolds that are pedestaled to the edge of the house. And in that profile, in the corner, you can see the very beginning of the burn layer just starting to dip down into the house basin. From all that charred material, we had some radiocarbon samples. Pat Emerson at the Historical Society was able to include them in one of the first legacy statewide survey radiocarbon study. And so on the curves on the right, the top one is an average of all the dates. The next two are from Eldon's 1967 house dig. The next three are from ours, and they all cluster very, very tightly. The 2 sigma range begins at 1653 AD, so much more recent than what we expected. Eldon thought these were like Kathio, associated with Kathio ceramics, so maybe like 800 years old at least, also ancestral to the Dakota, but much farther back in time. This is basically very near the end of when the Dakota lived at Mille Lacs. We can bring the 2 sigma range back through historic context. It's obviously wasn't, the houses weren't built in 1949. Clearly, based on the context and the archaeology, we can tighten it up to about 100-year range from between 1650 to 1750. The charred material also had an amazing amount of environmental evidence. So Seppo Valpu did archaeobotanical analysis from 3 of the 3 units that we dug in the burn layer. There were charred conifer needles, also wood charcoal from a variety of species that were probably related to construction of the house as well as materials within it. An amazing amount of food remains. Raspberries, blueberries, pin cherries, like kind of summer, late summer berries, but also other types of plants, mint, violet, bedstraw, all sorts of things. There's elderberry and violet and other environmental evidence. There's burned conifer resin. I love the ant heads. It was just an amazing thing. Amongst the artifacts, there were these curious little clay lumps. They're really small, and it took a while to figure out what they were. They're burned daub. So like the house structure was woven together, had with wood and other plant materials, and then it was packed with clay. And so then when the house burned and collapsed, some of the parts of it that had clay just were accidentally fired, and so they were preserved. On the upper left, you can see the impression of a kind of small diameter stick that's preserved in the fired clay. And as we got into this, it was an interesting comparison between the methods, the small scale methods we were using versus the large excavation that Eldon had done in 1967. And there are, thankfully, it was interesting to learn good ethnographic descriptions of Dakota earthlodge houses, and we didn't know that at the time yet, however, so we really struggled with this year to year. And the big contrast we had was that Eldon had dug the big area, had the outline of the house well defined, but didn't really, didn't have the profiles going across to have to deal with the structure of it. And so we did every year we were documenting the profiles, and the crazy colors there that I've depicted it in are all the mixed soil. And so what had happened, we finally came to realize was, the house was dug out, to be slightly below the surface. All of that soil had older artifacts in it, like the Brainerd Grimsherd that is probably 2,000 years old or more. And then the house was built, and that soil was put up on top. So it's an earth lodge. And then it somewhere around the late 17th century or around 1700, it burned and it collapsed. And so there you have all of those older artifacts above the very fragile and ephemeral burn layer that's securely dated, and below that, the intact soil that's cut right below the burn layer. So we did this for 10 years, and we felt like we had done enough. We had answered our research questions. We wanted to leave, we knew there was more of the bulk with the burn layer. We wanted to leave it intact. And so we were talking about that with the park manager, and then he went away to do some park manager thing. And then he came back, but he came back immediately with a chainsaw and he cut down these 2 trees. We were concerned about them because they were growing right next to where we knew the bulk was. And we thought, well, if there's a windstorm and they tip over, the roots would tear up what we were trying to preserve. And he was like, that's really cool. And anyway, he cut them down and made a bench out of one of them for the reading nook and the interpretive center. And that was a fantastic thing. So that was a 10-year project. In 2018, we were talking about continuing this, and Jim was really interested in this area of a different part of the site where, after a controlled burn, they'd seen some artifacts on the, just on the ground surface years before. And I was like, Jim, this isn't about houses. I don't know. And he was like, listen, this is the place. And I was like, okay. And so anyway, we dug, and it was, we dug there for 2 years and encountered this really remarkable, not quite a pavement, but like a concentration of pottery, a concentration of fire-cracked rock, interesting, mostly Kathio and Onamia pottery, but other kinds as well. Some really exotic lithics, including obsidian, Knife River flint. And we were wondering, like, well, what is this? What is the site formation process here? Why do we have all this pottery? Why do we have all this rock? And thankfully, then last year, the state park commissioned a geophysical survey, and here's some of the results of that. It includes our dig area, but on one side of us, there's a big fire hearth feature. Our dig is in the lower right. You can see the kind of a red, not quite a dot, but that's where our dig is. And then on the other side, to the east of it, a big feature that appears identical essentially to the earthlodge rectangular subterranean houses that we were digging on the other part of the site. So it is about seemingly houses after all. And this one is completely intact. No one's ever dug there, and it's absolutely preserved. So that was an exciting find. For next steps, we want to make this data available to Dakota communities. I think especially the environmental data, although that list of plants, I think people with traditional knowledge for their own purposes and within their communities might find that really interesting. We want to hand it over so they can do what they want with it. We need to finalize our report, think about other publication. I also want to update the National Register documentation, the original nominations from 1970. Clearly all the work at the site that Jim talked about, and then our work, it's got to be eligible under A for the broad patterns of history, definitely under C for architecture. We've learned a lot about that, and then D for information. And then down the road a little bit, that will help us with efforts to update the National Historic Landmark document, which is unchanged since 1964. There's a lot that's been known about the area since then. So, and thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.